Now, it's not every day you get to hear from the head of the world's biggest mining company, but today we have that opportunity. Please allow me to introduce our first guest, Mike Henry, the Chief Executive of BHP Group. Fluent in Japanese, Mr. Henry started his career in 1990 at Mitsubishi, the Japanese trading house. He joined BHP in 2003, progressing through a series of roles. In 2016, he was handed the responsibility of running the company's Australian operations. These encompass its flagship iron ore business. Now, Mike took the helm of BHP in January this year, and it's no exaggeration to say that he's hit the ground running, recently unveiling new climate targets for the business. In today's discussion, we're going to explore what Mike sees as some of the greatest challenges and opportunities facing the mining industry today. So there's a lot to get through. Let's get started. Mike, good evening there in Melbourne.
Hi, Neil.
So, listen, I'd like to start with a sort of a broad question, really, that can give you an opportunity to sort of outline your thoughts, really. And what I'd like to know is, where do you think the mining industry sits today? And also, where do you think it needs to be in the future?
Sure. Thanks, Neil. Well, look, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to make some opening remarks. I've been in role now for 10 months, and it would be fair to say that things haven't quite played out the way any of us had expected or planned for. We've all had to overcome a few challenges this year. But we've also been able to demonstrate once again what this industry is capable of and what we have to offer. It's been remarkable to see the way that companies were able to mobilize quickly to safeguard the health of our workforces, to support communities and our business partners, and to keep the bulk of our operations running. Our ability to keep operating and generating employment, taxes, royalties, and dividends in a time of crisis has been, I think, a positive differentiator relative to some other industries. Mining is essential, and we know this. I'm not talking here just about the value we create for our direct stakeholders. The resources we produce enable continued economic development and improvement in living standards around the world. In the end, there is little choice about whether mining happens or not. There is, though, choice about how it happens and who does it. In the face of events of the past year, countless lives have been disrupted, and many around the world have been focused on simple survival and then on recovery. But at the same time, there's also been a growing public focus on the need to secure a different and better future. And this is reflected in the Build Back Better concept, which captures 2 points. The world must return to growth to help improve living standards and drive prosperity. But this growth needs to be clean, sustainable, and of benefit to all. And our industry and business more generally has a role to play in that. In fact, the commodities we produce will be essential to building of that better world. Addressing climate change is, of course, one part of Building Back Better. And at BHP, we recently announced a new series of climate commitments and actions. And one of the things that I spoke about when we announced these commitments was the fact that decarbonization is actually going to require a whole lot more of many commodities. And that will be the case for some of the other components of building a better world as well. So through COVID-19, we've demonstrated quite definitively the value we create for our direct stakeholders. And secondly, we know that our efforts are essential for the world and the future, both positives. But the reality is that with opportunity also comes challenges. And I'll call out 3 interrelated trends: shifting expectations, evolving power dynamics, and escalating technical complexity. The expectations of society and our stakeholders continue to evolve and grow. And we all feel the increasing expectations and scrutiny from employees, governments, communities, and civil society more broadly. They're also more vocal and wielding power in unprecedented ways. They're demanding better standards. And when those standards aren't met, the repercussions can be significant and quite immediate. As we seek to meet the shifting and growing demand for some commodities, we're needing to deal with more complex social dynamics. We will need to be ever better in how we use water, energy, and other resources, and how we manage emissions, and how we better meet the rapidly evolving expectations of the societies in which we operate. Now, for some commodities that will be essential to the future, new ore bodies will be some combination of harder to find, harder to access, lower grade, and more costly and challenging to develop. This mix of increasing stakeholder complexity, greater technical challenges to accessing and developing resources, changing commodity mix, and faster pace of change is likely to mean that there will be clear winners and losers in our industry in the decade ahead. And taken together, I think these factors mean that advantage will increasingly accrue to scale. Growing risk, both below and above surface, means that winners are likely to be those companies who build and sustain serious technical and social capability in long-term relationships, who can learn from the shifting dynamics and increasing challenges in one jurisdiction before they flow on or migrate to another jurisdiction, who have the financial wherewithal to consistently fund the discovery and development of resources when it's going to be more costly and more complex to do so, who can sustain innovation and can be at the forefront of deploying latest technology for value, and who have the balance sheet resilience to manage risk and invest countercyclically. The increasing pace of change in stakeholder expectations, coupled with the consequences of not meeting them, means that more than ever, at minimum, companies need to be in tune with and responsive to what's happening around them. Even better placed will be those who can be ahead of the curve and who can help in shaping higher standards and better performance, and who see the opportunity to empower through mining and incorporate this mindset into the way they operate. Our industry not only delivers the commodities essential to daily life and economic progress around the world, but in doing so, it also has a large positive impact in terms of the economic and social empowerment of those around us. This includes through the way we engage First Nations peoples and the traditional owners of the lands on which we operate, our business partners, local communities, and employees. Creating broad-based social value and empowering others needs to permeate all that we do. And finally, shareholders. Demands on shareholders are increasing. They're required to be increasingly active in shaping the way companies in the sector operate and discriminating in who they invest in. They're increasingly demanding of companies in our sector. They insist that we operate to the highest of standards and that we're in tune with the world around us. And this isn't just because of the pressures they see from their investors, but because they recognize the importance of this to sustainable value creation. Now, the onus is on them to make fully informed choices based on rigorous assessment of ESG performance, consistently applied on a company-by-company basis. Our products will be central to any objectives of an ESG-focused portfolio, be it positioning for the energy transition or improving living standards around the world. It follows then that for those companies that consistently operate to the highest standards and are in tune with expectations of society, they should be a core holding of any ESG portfolio. Companies that get this right, who operate and relate to others in the right way, will generate outstanding value and returns for shareholders. They'll be better positioned to sense and manage risk, operate more reliably, access more opportunities, and grow more steadily. And the role that investors can play in this is to even more strongly reward these companies, the leaders, by prioritizing investment towards them over others, by making them a must-hold part of their portfolio. So just to wrap up then, the focus of this event is the new narrative for mining. And I really do think that the narrative is there. I'm quite interested in hearing from Mark and Ivan on this shortly. I think it's centered on the things that we've spoken about. Mining is essential. Global growth, decarbonization, renewables, electrification, none of this happens without the commodities we produce. The only choice for the industry and the world is how we do this. Overall standards must continue to rise. We need to ensure that we are operating ever more sustainably and that we're creating value for all our stakeholders. We need to support the economic and social empowerment of those around us. And investors have a role to play in this. They need to reinforce these trends through increasingly differentiating between leaders and laggards in this regard. The best companies in an essential sector are going to do very well for shareholders and for the world. And with that, Neil, I might pass back to you, as I know you're keen to spend a bit of time on Q&A as well.
Yes, I am. Thank you for that, Mike. And there's quite a bit to unpack in your comments there. So let's get straight down to it. Look, there's one sort of question that I want to ask a lot of our panelists today. And I mean, it sort of involves social license to operate and the whole societal debate. Now, 50 years ago, the celebrated economist Milton Friedman set out what he believed was the overriding purpose of a company: to maximize profits. And this did set the tone for a whole generation of leaders and their shareholders. But as the incident at Juukan Gorge in Australia this year has shown, that companies really can't operate under that sort of narrow remit anymore. They need a new compact with society. So, I mean, I'm just wondering where you stand on this debate. I mean, what is the social purpose of BHP as the world's biggest mining company? And also, I mean, I just note from your speech there, I mean, you're saying the companies that relate to others in the right way and operate in the right way will get outstanding value and returns for shareholders. So can you just give us your thinking, you know, philosophically, where you stand on, you know, what the social purpose of BHP is?
Okay, well, look, thanks, Neil. I don't think it's a choice. In fact, I think it's both. We have an accountability to be creating great value and returns for shareholders and growing value for all those others that depend on a company like BHP or the industry. And I think, you know, the reality is that our stakeholders have spoken on this. So companies like BHP are reliant upon, for us to continue to operate and thrive, we're reliant upon capital, people or labor, and resources. And, you know, if I think about capital or the providers of capital to us in the industry, our shareholders, they've made it quite clear, or at least many of our shareholders and our bigger shareholders have made it clear that they expect us to be creating value for a broader range of stakeholders and operating sustainably at the same time as continuing to generate great value and returns. People, the people want to come work for companies whose purpose and values align with the things that they believe in. And then the communities and governments that we rely upon for resources, they're also quite clear that they expect to be, you know, us to be doing more than just creating a steady royalty stream or, you know, paying taxes. Of course, they need those things and want those things, but they also want us to be generating value for a broader range of people out there, business partners, communities, and so on. So I think the reality, Neil, is that it's both. And this isn't just for our industry. If you look at what the challenge confronting governments these days with COVID-19, in the period ahead, governments are going to need to somehow stimulate economic recovery, but they also need to do so in a way that is environmentally sustainable and which looks after people. And that's really what sits behind this Build Back Better concept that I mentioned earlier. That's, you know, assuring the economic recovery, but doing so through the way that they do so, ensuring that there's a better future created. And that's the way that we need to be thinking as well. Through the way that we operate, we need to be creating social value for all. And the companies that can do that, I think, will be much better positioned. Those are going to be the companies that win over time, because getting that right, not seeing it as a dichotomy, but getting it right and being able to achieve both at the same time, that's a pretty distinctive capability.
But how do you get it right? Because the mining industry is one that's had a sort of a B2B, you know, sort of focus and relationship with its end customer for a long while. It sort of strikes me, I mean, you look at the board compositions of a lot of companies and things like that, perhaps they don't adequately reflect what's going on in society. So how do you improve your antennae to make sure that you're keeping pace with what's happening out there in society?
Well, that's a very interesting point you make there, Neil, because you're right. Traditionally, there's been perhaps a bit of a B2B feel to things, where in fact we need to be adopting some of the same philosophies and attitudes that you see in B2C organizations. Even though I'm not claiming that we in our industry are actually B2C, we need to adopt some of those same mentalities. We need to be in tune with those around us and constantly paying attention to what their needs and aspirations are. Now, your question was, how do we go about doing that? I think one key factor, well, I'll flag two things, actually. One is that it needs to start with the top. So there needs to be an attitude in the company, starting with senior leadership and boards and so on, where everybody really gets the need to be listening to and wants to listen to all of those around us to understand what their concerns are, what their needs and aspirations are, and then fold that back into the key decisions that we need to take. So I think that's very important. Secondly, we need to have a workforce that is in tune with the world around us and who also prioritize the creation of social value. And there's two halves to that. So one is, the composition of the workforce. How can we possibly be in tune with the society around us if we have a workforce that is not representative of the societies that we operate in? Mm-hmm. So I think there's an onus on the industry to create a more inclusive culture and to create or recraft the composition of our workforce to be more aligned to the societies that we operate in. That's point one. Second point then is that we really do need to make an accountability through the company. It needs to be embedded in decision making, in the way that people think. We have to ensure that everybody in all that they do are thinking about, the impact of their work, positive and negative, on those around us, including outside the mine gate.
Okay. I mean, you mentioned investors there, and it does seem that the industry is held in low esteem by a lot of investors and also parts of wider society, even though, as you've explained, its products are crucial to creating better living standards and also to the energy transition. So, I mean, what do you think needs to be done to change perceptions then? And I mean, I thought your point also on scale accruing, the advantage companies will be the ones of scale. Well, I mean, that may be true, but I think we've seen over the last couple of years that it's been the big companies that have been getting themselves into difficulties. When I think about Brumadinho, Samarco, what's happened at Yukon Gorge, the Siberian oil spill we've seen this year, regulatory investigations at some of your peers. I mean, how does the mining industry then, change its perception so it is, more valued?
Okay, there's a lot in that question, Neil. And sure, the industry has further to go, and we have to somehow, gain the same understanding and appreciation and focus on the industry, the essential nature of the industry, and the value that we bring as we have on our performance. Now, in order to do that, what are the things that we need to think about? Well, I think that the essential nature of what we do, and by that I mean that, it all starts with mining at the end of the day. Whether it be industrials or tech companies, decarbonization, there's a role that mining plays in all of that. It all starts with mining, and I think that there needs to be an appreciation of that, because if one appreciates that, then one would recognize that as the world seeks to decarbonize, or as other sectors seek to grow, that has certain implications for growth in the mining industry, and many of them positive. The second thing, is ESG performance, because you flagged there some of the issues that have occurred in industry, and I think that the extractives industry more generally, of course, has been seen at times to be behind the curve in terms of meeting the expectations and of society and the standards that society demands. And so I think that we constantly need to be lifting standards in industry, and we can't do that just through being in tune with our stakeholders and responding when their expectations change, because then we're kind of in a very reactive loop, and it always looks like we're behind the curve. There's an onus on us to lead, to understand what's right, and to be leading in a way that front runs some of the concerns that will invariably arise in broader society. And again, as I said earlier, the companies that get that right, I think, will be the companies that win. Final point in the question that you asked there, Neil, was around value. And of course, those first couple of things contribute to value. But I think there's also a view that we are a cyclical industry. And so, of course, that then gets reflected in the way that cash flows and get valued, and views of risk and so on. But I think what can be missed at times is that some companies in the sector have less volatile cash flows because of the way that they're structured and their scale and so on. And so one would hope that investors will recognize over time that certain companies in the sector have less volatility and less risk. And if you couple that then with the distinctive capability required to lead in a way that is more aligned to and in tune with society around us, that's a pretty powerful combination. And you would hope that that would then get reflected in valuations, because Neil, the global mining industry is probably worth $600-700 billion US dollars, and if another comparator would be industrials. If we were valued like industrials, we'd be double that. And maybe that's too much to hope for, but certainly there's room to play, or things to play for the industry overall, if we can get that combination of ESG leadership and and the right performance that leads to less volatile cash flows through the way that we're structured and so on, right.
Yeah, and I mean, and there is a valuation gap that does need to be addressed, really, because when you see some of the valuations being put on renewables companies and other corporates that are playing into the energy transition, it does seem as if the industry has been slightly left behind on that front, I think. Just another question.
And lots to play for.
Yeah, I mean, just another question, just around sort of the big issue. Well, I mean, another one of the big issues of our time, climate change. I mean, you've outlined some, pretty tough new goals sort of around scope 1 and 2 emissions. But I guess that's the easy part sort of thing. Scope 3 is the elephant in the room, if you like. And also you're continuing to sort of do deals in oil and gas as well. So I just wonder, I mean, do you think you're sort of undoing sort of your emissions reductions efforts by that focus still on oil? And just on scope 3, I mean, how do you really address something like that, which is, in the hands of your customers, by cutting production of fossil fuels? I don't know.
So great questions, Neil. And I'll start by saying addressing scope 1 and scope 2 doesn't feel easy. It is challenging, but it's something we've been focused on for quite a long time now. And so, within the sector and, certainly amongst the majors, we're at the low end of the spectrum when it comes to absolute scope 1 and 2 emissions, in spite of our size. And per the recent commitments that we made, we're going to take that, or reduce that by a further 30% in the next decade, on path to becoming net zero by 2050. And that's, there is an accountability on us all to get to net zero in terms of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. But like you say, scope 3 is also, something that we all need to be turning our minds to. And the dilemma here is that, for upstream companies like us, we don't control many of the decisions that are required to address scope 3. However, that doesn't mean that we can ignore it. We do have an accountability to engage and play a role in reducing scope 3 emissions. Now, the role that we can play, in my view, and I'll come back to your question around portfolio in a second, Neil, but in my view, at the end of the day, what's going to solve the world's climate challenge is going to be, well, a combination of 3 things. One is regulatory change that puts hard barriers in place to drive emissions reduction. Secondly is going to be technological solutions or advancement of technologies. And the third will be change consumer behavior. That's it. It's those 3 things. And so for our industry, where can we play in that, or where do we have an accountability to act? It's on the regulatory change and the advocacy that we bring to bear on that. And secondly is on supporting technological advancement. And the great thing here is that our industry has reach, given the number of value chains that we're part of, given the geographies that we operate across, either in production or sales. So if we bring our technical prowess to bear and partner with others, because that's the other thing here, is no single company can solve this. We have to partner laterally in the industry, but also vertically in our value chains with others to help others solve their emissions reductions ambitions. And so that's where we're electing to focus. And as part of the recent commitments that we announced, I did speak about very tangible actions that we're going to be taking in shipping and steel, where we feel we can have an outsized impact if we contribute financially, if we bring our technical capability to bear. We think we can have a larger impact in terms of helping steel mills or the shipping industry to decarbonize. Now, Neil, you asked the question about portfolio, and maybe it depends a little bit on the problem that you're trying to solve. But if the problem that you're trying to solve is global reduction in emissions, well, my view is changing a portfolio has some total, zero impact on that. Yep. And so we've rather chosen to focus on tangible things that will actually help to solve the world's emissions problem. Now, on petroleum, because you asked that specifically, the world is going to need petroleum or oil and gas for a long time yet, because it's essential to human mobility and to many of the industrial processes that support life as we know it today. That's not just our view. You look at the views of the IPCC and others, there's a general acceptance that for some time, oil and gas demand is going to continue. And because of the particular dynamics of that industry, there's going to be attractive returns that can be generated for shareholders in doing so. But we've adopted a very balanced approach around this. So we've said that we'll invest in attractive opportunities where we can be confident in returns over the time horizon in which the industry will remain attractive. We're divesting out of more mature assets with less upside. And we've said that this focus is really for the short to medium term, that we'll continue, that we see this industry as being attractive.
Okay, well, thank you, Mike. Sadly, we've run out of time, and it's a real pity because I had a whole host of other questions to ask you. But anyway, it was great to hear your thoughts on so many of the big sort of overarching aspects of and challenges facing mining today. So thank you for that, and we can now allow you to go and enjoy your evening in Melbourne.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Neil, for having me.
Okay, thank you. And now it's time to hand over to Dubai and our industry commentator, Ethna Trainer. She's going to join us now for a summary of the last session.
Thank you so much, Neil. And indeed, a lot of questions that you had to ask him, but I'm sure throughout the day, you're going to maybe get to put those questions to some of the other executives that are going to be with us. I'm delighted to be here with you. And of course, that was Mike Henry, the CEO of BHP Group. Really interesting conversation there. I mean, fascinating look at what's going on, particularly in his business there. But he talked, I think, very generally about the state of the mining industry too, and really put a bit of a call to action there, I think, to many of his peers as well. Talked about the social purpose, as Neil asked him there, of BHP, and he talked about the accountability to the shareholders and indeed to the stakeholders, and just how important that is. As he said, focusing on resources, capital, labor, all of these in many ways equally important. And again, making sure that a company like BHP was accountable to everybody. As he said, the essential nature of the mining industry is something perhaps that we sometimes forget about. The world has been so dependent on this industry for economic growth and indeed for everything we do. And when you step back, of course, people watching this for the most part in the industry know this very well, but the wider population perhaps maybe doesn't pay as much attention. But again, the extractive sector probably needs to be more proactive and needs to make sure that they get it right, because there's a lot of pressures on the industry right now and everybody really needs to just up their standards a little bit in terms of what he was talking about. Oil and gas for BHP also will remain on the radar. As he said, the demands from society for oil and gas still very, very important. And so they're going to stay in that. But again, they will divest from probably more mature assets and a lot to do. He talked a little bit about operational continuity, particularly in COVID times, and really said how the industry came into its own very much so in terms of maintaining that operational continuity, again, essential for economic growth. But he said that everybody really needs to be looking at more sustainable growth. And commodities been so important to the Build Back Better for everybody. And when he looks at decarbonization, we all really need to look at the fact that there will probably be more demands, not less, on commodities that are produced in the mining sector. So for BHP, a broader range of stakeholders, of course, to be looked at. Stakeholders and shareholders both need to be kept happy, and a lot of responsibility coming to both. And as he said, the companies who get this right will be the winners, but everybody really needs to be looking out on both and looking very, very importantly in terms of what has to be done. The industry needs to be more aligned. Everybody needs to be looking at the work that's on society and again, being more proactive to deliver it. When he talked about shareholder value, it was interesting there and said that the mining industry in general is what? Between $600 and $700 billion. That's the global worth of it right now. So very interesting there that maybe the market is maybe undervaluing it right now, but indeed an awful lot to play for because the value to society and to the industry is actually very wide. But it's about cash flow, it's about risk, it's a cyclical industry, and people really need to get it right. Investors, of course, looking for less volatility and less risk. But over time, I think investors get used to what company actually delivers that. So huge focus there. And for global requirements, when it comes to emissions, people need to be looking on technical ability, technology, the new shift in that, regulatory change, and indeed the change from consumer behavior. All of that's so important. So looking at shareholders, looking at stakeholders, really aligning the expectations of both and making sure that a company, all the companies in the mining industry really being very accountable and being very responsible. So a very optimistic note in many ways. talking to just about everybody out there in terms of what's going on, leading a bit of a call to action to the industry, and also maybe a message to the investment community out there too, in terms of the fact that this industry is working so hard and it is looking at its safety records, it is looking at its investment portfolios, it's also looking at what it needs to do in the future, it's paying attention. And on this note, I think we get our mining summit off to a really good start. As he said, whoever gets it right will be the winners. And when we think of it in this industry, $600 to $700 billion, there's a lot to play for. So a great start to the morning there. And thank you, Neil, for that interview. Of course, coming up in just a few minutes, Neil is going to be very, very busy today. He will look at a new narrative for mining, and he's going to be talking to the CEOs of Anglo American and Glencore. So stay with us. We'll be right back in just a few minutes.